The Bakongo people were known for their extraordinary spiritual abilities, which the colonizers often misunderstood or feared. These abilities, rooted in the knowledge of the four elements, Nzaku, Mpanzu, Nzinga, and Funza, and the power of ancestral connection, led some European invaders to believe that the Congo people were angels or beings with supernatural origins. The four elements and their spiritual powers. Nzak fire, the power of light and divine strength. Nzaku represents the sun, fire, energy, and war. Those with the Nzaku gift could manipulate fire. Some Congo warriors were said to control flames during battle. They could channel energy, moyo mukumbi. Elders could project spiritual force, ki, chi, prana, to heal or destroy. Some could summon lightning, and Kungunzazi, the kingdom of Luango, had priests who could call lightning to strike enemies. Fire resistance was also a known ability. Initiates of the Nzaku path could walk on fire or remain untouched by flames. Famous Nzaku warriors include King Nsaku Navunda, a warrior diplomat who could read people's souls, and Nzinga Mbemba, King Afonso I, said to have spiritual visions of fire guiding his wars. Mpanzu, water, the power of healing and spirit communication. Mpanzu represents the moon, water, emotions, and hidden knowledge. Those with the Mpanzu gift could control water, Maza Mpanzu. Some Bakongo diviners were known to make water move at will. They could heal through water, and Shaka Maza, sacred springs were used for spiritual healing, like modern Reiki. They could also communicate with spirits. Water was a portal to the ancestral realm, Mpemba, and summoned storms. The Luango priests were said to call rain or storms in battle. Famous Mpanzu mystics include Queen Nzinga of Ndongo, who used spiritual water rituals for strength and war, and Kimpavita, Dona Beatriz, a prophetess who healed through water blessings. Nzinga, wind and air, the power of speed, levitation, and prophecy. Nzinga represents the wind, breath, and the connection between life and death. Those with the Nzinga gift could run at unnatural speeds, Mukanzu Mbuluzulu. Congo warriors moved so fast they seemed to vanish. They could fly or levitate, Mpambu Kinzing. Shamans could hover or appear to glide above the ground. Some controlled the wind. Healers summoned strong winds to remove negative spirits. Prophecy, Lusenzi Ludimbu, was another skill, as those with the Nzinga gift could see the future, like seers. Famous Nzinga prophets and warriors include Nganga Mpanzu, said to have floated over rivers to escape enemies, and Queen Nzinga, who was believed to move like the wind in battle. Funza, earth, the power of strength, creation, and transformation. Funza represents the earth, stability, endurance, and spiritual grounding. Those with the Funza gift could demonstrate superhuman strength, Nitu Munzenza. Congo warriors lifted huge rocks or knocked down trees with their bare hands. Some could communicate with animals, while others transformed objects, Muna Funza. Blacksmiths shaped metal with their bare hands through spiritual heat. Some merged with nature, Nkisi Bakala. Hunters blended into forests, becoming invisible. Famous Funza guardians include the Nganga of Luango, who used sacred earth magic to shield warriors from bullets, and the blacksmith priests, who could shape iron without tools, using only their hands and Nkisi power. Many warriors, healers, and initiates of the mystical schools of the Congo Kingdom displayed abilities similar to what we see in anime, like Dragon Ball, Naruto, or Avatar, where control over nature, energy, and spirit was a reality. Colonizers feared Congo's spiritual powers. European missionaries and colonial invaders documented strange abilities among the Bakongo people. Some even believed the kingdom of Luango was inhabited by angels. Portuguese chronicles, 1500s to 1600s, mention Congo warriors who were immune to bullets, spiritual leaders who could disappear and reappear, and prophets who predicted the downfall of colonial forces. French and Dutch records 1600s to 1700s mention magicians who could summon lightning and storms, women warriors who could move with unnatural speed, and healers who cured deadly wounds in seconds. Many of these powers were later demonized as witchcraft by Christian missionaries to suppress the Congo people's resistance. How did the Bakongo train their spiritual gifts? The Bakongo people trained in specialized spiritual gifts connected to the four elements, Nzaku, Mpanzu, Nzinga, and Funza. These gifts were passed down through secret societies, rituals, and spiritual education, ensuring that only the worthy could unlock their full potential. Spiritual training involved secret societies, mukulu. The Bakongo initiated young men and women into sacred secret societies where they learned how to unlock and use their spiritual gifts. Kimpasi Society trained warriors in Zaku, fire, and Zinga, wind, powers. Mubiti Society trained healers and diviners in Mpanzu, water, abilities. Kibanda Society trained earth shamans in Funza, earth, abilities. Nganga seers trained prophets to connect with the ancestors and read the future. Rituals for power development varied. Nzaku, fire, initiates walked on fire and channeled energy through their bodies to strike with supernatural strength. Mpanzu, water, initiates underwent water purification ceremonies and healing rituals. Nzinga, wind, initiates practiced wind summoning and levitation. Funza, earth, initiates connected deeply with the land and used sacred earth for magic and protection. Kongo warriors used these abilities in battle. King Shaku Ne Vunda was said to possess the power of fire and could call down lightning to strike enemies. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo was believed to summon rain to drown her enemies and disappear into the wind. Nganga warriors used earth magic to create impenetrable shields and raise mountains to trap enemy forces. These powers were suppressed due to colonization. Christianity labeled Bakongo spiritual practices as witchcraft. Sacred sites were destroyed, forced conversions took place, and many kings abandoned spiritual traditions in favor of European alliances. Despite this, knowledge was passed down in secret. Elders continued oral traditions, secret initiations, and hidden rituals. The impact of slavery also played a role in the loss of these spiritual gifts. Bakongo captives carried their traditions to the Americas, where their spiritual practices merged with local beliefs, leading to syncretic religions like Vodou, Candomblé, and Palo. Despite colonial suppression, the spiritual practices of the Bakongo people have survived in hidden forms. As people reconnect with their roots and ancestors, there has been a revival of interest in traditional rituals and the four elements. Many are rediscovering the powers of Nzaku, Mpanzu, Nzinga, and Funza in modern spiritual practices, not just as a form of resistance, but also as a way to connect with their ancestral divine gifts. Would you like to explore more about the hidden practices that survived, or do you want to dive deeper into the modern revival of these teachings? The lost and hidden spiritual gifts of the Bakongo. The Bakongo people's spiritual gifts, rooted in their deep connection to the elements, fire, Nzaku, water, Panzu, wind, Nzinga, and earth, Funza, have faced a long and tumultuous history of being suppressed and hidden by external forces. These forces sought to disrupt and eradicate the spiritual practices that were seen as a threat to colonial control. The process of losing and hiding these powers was not simply about suppression. It also involved the rewriting of history, the destruction of sacred knowledge, and the displacement of entire cultural systems. The disruption and rewriting of history. As colonial powers, particularly Christian missionaries and European colonizers, sought to establish dominance over African peoples, they found the Bakongo's deep spiritual practices to be an obstacle to their control. These practices were not only connected to the physical world, but also to spiritual realms, giving the Bakongo the power to influence the material world in ways that the colonizers could not understand or control. Thus, the spiritual practices were demonized, and the Congo cosmogram, Dekenga, was seen as a form of paganism that needed to be eradicated. Spiritual warfare and propaganda. Colonial forces used propaganda to rewrite the history of the Bakongo, painting them as primitive or savage in their religious practices. The spirituality of the Bakongo was labeled as witchcraft, and the spiritual gifts of the people were falsely portrayed as a threat to civilization. This was done to justify the forceful conversion to Christianity, which sought to replace ancestral knowledge with Western religious teachings. In this context, any spiritual power that could be linked to ancestral worship or the elements of nature was systematically suppressed, and new belief systems were introduced to weaken the Bakongo people's connection to their heritage. Displacement of sacred knowledge. The colonial authorities, who were keen on destroying the power and influence of the Bakongo people, displaced much of their sacred knowledge. The first step in this was the destruction of sacred sites, such as temples, ancestral burial grounds, and shrines. These were central places of learning where spiritual gifts were passed on through oral traditions and rituals. Sacred groves, mountains, rivers, and even certain animal totems, all of which had spiritual significance to the Bakongo, were targeted for conversion or destruction. This led to the loss of powerful practices that had been passed down for generations. Repression. Through forced conversion, the forced conversions to Christianity had a profound impact on the Bakongo's spiritual practices. It wasn't just a matter of abandoning old gods, it was a complete reconfiguration of the Bakongo's entire worldview. Christian missionaries saw the traditional spiritual practices of the Bakongo as evil and superstitious, often labeling the Nganga, traditional healer, as a witch. This led to the persecution of spiritual leaders and practitioners. The missionaries replaced the ancestral spiritual systems with a rigid, one-size-fits-all religious doctrine, often using violence, fear, and coercion to maintain control. Many were baptized under duress, and the connection to ancestral wisdom was broken. The survival and preservation of Congo spiritual gifts. Despite the repression, the spiritual gifts and practices of the Bakongo did not vanish entirely. They survived, albeit in a hidden and altered form, often passed down through secret societies or in the form of syncretic practices. In the Caribbean, Brazil, and Cuba, the descendants of enslaved people found ways to preserve their spiritual traditions by combining African ancestral beliefs with elements of Christianity, often in the form of candomblé, santeria, and vodou. The role of ancestors in preservation. Ancestral veneration became a key practice that helped to preserve the spiritual gifts of the Bakongo. While Christianity tried to eliminate ancestral worship, many African people continued to honor their ancestors in private rituals, often using Christian symbols, like crosses, in ways that had dual meanings. The spirit world, with its complex layers of time and dimensions, remained accessible through the ancestors. Nganga, traditional healer or spiritual guide, often became the spiritual intermediary who maintained the knowledge of herbs, rituals, and ancestral knowledge, ensuring that these gifts would continue to be practiced and passed on to future generations. The preservation of the elements. The four elements, fire, water, wind, and earth, remained integral to the spiritual systems of the Bakongo. While colonizers attempted to suppress and control these gifts, the elemental powers of Nzaku, fire, Mpanzu, water, Nzinga, wind, and Funza, earth, found their way into the underground spiritual practices. Nzaku, fire, warriors, even after the colonial period, used the symbolism of fire as a source of strength and resilience. In secret ceremonies, the power of fire was invoked to embolden the spirit and fortify the community. Mpanzu, water. Water rituals for healing, purification, and ancestor communication were preserved in secret ceremonies, where sacred rivers or springs served as portals to the spiritual world. Nzinga, wind. The ability to communicate with the winds and spirits was passed down, often through oral traditions and spiritual practices. Some groups would perform rituals in sacred groves during eclipses or seasonal changes, continuing to harness the power of the wind for divination and healing. Funza, earth. The spiritual connection to the earth was one of the most resilient, as many African people continued to honor the land and its spiritual significance. The use of earth for healing rituals, divination, and ancestral ceremonies persisted in many communities. How the Bakongo spiritual gifts were hidden and passed on. Codification and symbolism. One of the ways the Bakongo hid their spiritual gifts was by coding them within symbols, rituals, and art forms that were not immediately recognizable to the colonizers. Sacred masks, ceremonial attire, and ritual dances often contained hidden meanings that only initiates could understand. Syncretism and spiritual secrecy. In the Americas and other parts of the African diaspora, spiritual secrecy was essential to preserving traditional knowledge. Practices such as vodou in Haiti, santeria in Cuba, and candomblé in Brazil incorporated African elements with Christian imagery, allowing the practices to survive and thrive while appearing Christian on the surface. The Bakongo's practices were adapted in a similar fashion, especially in diasporic communities. Reviving the spiritual powers of the Bakongo. Today, there is a resurgence of interest in reconnecting with the spiritual heritage of the Bakongo people. This revival often focuses on rediscovering lost knowledge, reclaiming ancestral wisdom, and healing the spiritual and emotional wounds caused by colonialism and the forced suppression of their practices. The four elements, fire, water, wind, and earth, are once again seen as powerful forces that can connect individuals to their ancestral wisdom and the natural world. Many spiritual practitioners and healers are now focusing on rituals, herbalism, and spiritual guidance to reclaim the spiritual gifts of the Bakongo. As more people delve into these practices, the spiritual legacy of the Bakongo people continues to thrive, proving that despite centuries of suppression, their gifts remain alive in the hearts and souls of those who seek them. The current revival of Bakongo spiritual practices and its impact on modern spiritual movements. In recent years, there's been a powerful revival of Bakongo spiritual practices. This resurgence is not just a return to ancient rituals, but a reclamation of the spiritual gifts that were suppressed during colonial rule. This movement is taking place across the African diaspora, particularly in regions where Bakongo descendants are trying to reconnect with their roots, including in the Americas, Brazil, Caribbean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The modern revival is an effort to heal the trauma of colonialism, reclaim ancestral wisdom, and integrate spiritual healing into today's world. The spiritual awakening and reconnection. The spiritual awakening among the Bakongo descendants is a growing movement that recognizes the importance of returning to the ancestral ways of communication with the spirits and natural forces. Many are turning to traditional healing practices, ancestor veneration, and the four elements, fire, water, wind, earth, to reconnect with their spiritual identity. Empowering the individual through the four elements. In modern times, the four elements, Nzaku, Mpanzu, Nzinga, Funza, are seen as sources of empowerment and healing. The teachings associated with these elements have gained significant attention in spiritual and healing communities across the globe. Nzaku, fire, is used as a symbol of purification, passion, and renewal. Modern practitioners use fire rituals to ignite personal transformation and to burn away negative energies. These rituals can include meditation by candlelight, symbolic use of fire to empower one's will, and even community fires for collective healing. Mpanzu, water. Water has always been a symbol of healing, cleansing, and spiritual renewal. Modern spiritual practices involving water include cleansing rituals, healing baths, and the use of sacred rivers or streams for connecting with ancestors. The rising tide of interest in water as a healer connects deeply with sacred springs and rain ceremonies, allowing practitioners to tap into ancient wisdom for emotional and physical healing. Nzinga, wind. The wind has become a powerful metaphor for freedom, communication, and change in contemporary spiritual movements. Wind rituals are used for clearing the mind, allowing mental clarity, and invoking spirit guides. Some practitioners use wind instruments, such as flutes or drums, to engage with the spirits of the wind, invoking the power of change and transformation. Funza, earth. Earth represents stability, nourishment, and grounding. Modern spiritualists work with the earth by using grounding techniques, working with sacred plants, and connecting to the land through rituals involving planting and harvesting. There's an increasing movement towards connecting to sacred sites and earth healing, aligning with the principles of eco-spirituality and eco-activism. The global reawakening and spiritual identity. Around the world, there is a rising interest in African spiritual traditions, particularly those of the Bakongo people. Many individuals of African descent are reclaiming their heritage, not just in the spiritual sense, but also in the cultural and psychological sense. For many, this return to their roots is part of a global movement that challenges the legacy of colonialism, oppression, and historical amnesia. Digital platforms and social media as tools for revival. The internet and social media have become powerful tools for the revival of African spiritual traditions. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok have given people a chance to share and learn from the experiences of others, whether through sharing knowledge about traditional rituals, ancestral veneration, or spiritual gifts. This digital revival has created an interconnected network of people rediscovering their spiritual roots. The future of Bakongo spirituality. Future of Bakongo spirituality looks promising as younger generations reconnect with their ancestral roots through modernized yet authentic practices. Many are looking to the past to heal and move forward, integrating spiritual knowledge with modern life. It is clear that spiritual healing, rooted in the ancient wisdom of the Bakongo, will continue to transform lives and communities. This movement is a testament to the resilience of the Bakongo people and their ability to survive and thrive in the face of adversity, offering a pathway to spiritual liberation and a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness between the natural world, the ancestors, and the living. The Bakongo people have a rich tradition of prophets and spiritual leaders who played a pivotal role in guiding their communities, especially during times of crisis or significant cultural upheaval. These prophets often came with spiritual powers, delivering messages from the ancestors, foretelling the future, and calling their people to action. Their spiritual abilities ranged from healing and divination to the power to bring natural forces into alignment, like storms or droughts, and they were seen as mediators between the physical world and the spiritual realms. Ne Mbakala Nzondo, the Cyclone Prophet. Ne Mbakala Nzondo is one of the most famous prophets in Bakongo history. His name means the voice of the ancestors, and his power was so great that he was said to be like a cyclone, a powerful force of nature capable of transforming lives. Spiritual power. Ne Mbakala Nzondo had the ability to invoke powerful natural forces like storms and lightning, which he used to strike down those who were seen as enemies or oppressors. This made him a symbol of divine justice. Role and struggles. He rose during times when the Congo kingdom was under pressure from colonial and internal forces. His message often challenged colonial rule, calling for a return to ancestral traditions and the reclaiming of African identity. He was known to have powerful visions, seeing the past, present, and future. Prophecy. Ne Mbakala Nzondo foretold a future where the Bakongo people would regain their spiritual independence, but also warned of internal struggles and conflicts that would arise as people navigated the return to their roots. His prophecies emphasized the need for unity and faith in their ancestors. Simon Kimbangu, the prophet of the Kimbanguist Church. Simon Kimbangu was one of the most influential prophets in Central Africa and is especially significant in the Congo region. His spiritual powers and prophecies brought about the Kimbanguist Church, which remains a major religious movement in Congo and beyond. Spiritual power. Simon Kimbangu was said to have performed miracles like healing the sick, raising the dead, and performing other supernatural feats. His connection with the divine was so strong that his followers believed he had the power to command the spirits and to bring peace or destruction depending on the people's alignment with ancestral traditions. Role and struggles. He was arrested and imprisoned by the Belgian colonizers because his movement was seen as a threat to their authority. Despite his imprisonment, his teachings spread, and he became a symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. Prophecy. Kimbangu's messages focused on the restoration of African spirituality and the unification of African peoples. He preached about the coming of a new era where the African people would rise above the oppression they had been subjected to and reclaim their spiritual power. Simeon Toko, the Tokoist prophet. Simeon Toko, 1918 to 1984, was the founder of the Tokoist Church and is one of the most powerful and mysterious figures in African spiritual history. His life was marked by extraordinary events, and his spiritual power challenged both colonial rulers and religious institutions. Spiritual power. Simeon Toko was known for miraculous events, including stopping airplanes mid-flight, healing the sick, and surviving multiple assassination attempts. One of the most shocking events was when he was cut into pieces, only for his body to miraculously heal and reassemble itself, proving his divine power. Role and struggles. He was repeatedly arrested by Portuguese authorities and spent years in prison for his teachings, which were seen as a threat to colonial control. Despite extreme persecution, he continued to preach the spiritual liberation of Africans, emphasizing the need for Africans to reconnect with their spiritual heritage. His movement gained thousands of followers, and the Tokoist Church became a major force in Central Africa. Prophecy. Simeon Toko spoke of a time when Africa would spiritually awaken and rise to reclaim its divine destiny. His teachings emphasized that African spirituality had been deliberately suppressed but would one day return stronger than ever. Today, his followers believe that his prophecies are unfolding as more people reconnect with their ancestral roots. The legacy of these Bakongo prophets lives on, guiding a new generation towards spiritual awakening and empowerment. The legacy of the Bakongo prophets. The Bakongo prophets were central figures in the resistance against both colonialism and the forced imposition of foreign religions. They sought to preserve their people's cultural identity, often foretelling a future where their communities would rise above oppression. Many of these prophets believed that spirituality would lead to the reclamation of power, healing, and unity for the African people. The Bakongo prophets also envisioned a future where spiritual gifts like healing, divination, and ancestral communication would once again flourish. These figures laid the foundation for the spiritual resurgence that is still taking place among the Bakongo descendants today. The Bakongo people have long been revered for their deep spiritual connection to the earth, cosmos, and nature. Their belief system integrates supernatural abilities, spiritual practices, and the use of cosmic forces in ways that parallel many ancient and modern depictions of superpowers, such as in stories like Dragon Ball or Naruto, but grounded in real cultural practices and ancestral wisdom. The Bakongo people, like many African communities, experienced profound trauma and resistance during the colonial period. The European colonizers were not only interested in exploiting the land and resources of Africa, but also feared the spiritual power and the resistance posed by African leaders, particularly the kings, queens, and spiritual elders of the Kongo kingdom. Captured Kongo elders, kings, and queens. During the colonial era, many Kongo rulers and spiritual leaders were captured, exiled, or killed. Some of the most notable figures were kingdom leaders who led successful uprisings against colonial rule and the transatlantic slave trade. Their resistance was not just military, but also deeply spiritual, as they called on the ancestors for protection and guidance. King Afonso I, Zingambemba, though not directly captured in the colonial era, he ruled from 1506 to 1543, was one of the most powerful figures in the Kongo kingdom. He initially tried to align with the Portuguese, but as the slave trade expanded, he fought against their influence. His later attempts to free his people from European exploitation were undermined by Portuguese colonialism. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo, while not directly from Congo, was an important figure in resistance during the colonial period in the region of the Kingdom of Ndongo, modern-day Angola. Known for her strategic brilliance and leadership, she fought against Portuguese invaders. Her connection to Kongo culture and spirituality was evident as she utilized both military and spiritual powers to defend her kingdom. The Kongo kings and spiritual leaders were known for their ability to wield spiritual power. They used ancestral wisdom to guide their people, and in doing so, they invoked immense spiritual authority. The Portuguese and other colonial powers viewed this authority as a direct threat to their dominance. European fear of spiritual power. The colonizers understood that African leaders were not merely fighting with physical weapons. They were also wielding spiritual power that came from their deep connection with ancestral spirits. The Europeans understood that the Kongo people had a strong belief in the return of their ancestors, and many feared that if these leaders' bodies or bones were not destroyed, they would return to guide and protect their people. Fear of resurrection. One of the key reasons that the colonizers desecrated the remains of the Kongo kings and queens was the belief that their spirits would return if their bodies were allowed to remain intact. The European authorities feared that these figures could come back and lead uprisings, inspire revolts, or reclaim their land from European control. Desecration of royal remains. The Europeans were so afraid of the power of these leaders that they took the remains of royal figures, elders, and resistance leaders, and either sent them to Europe or destroyed them. Some were mutilated, others were burned, and in some extreme cases, the bodies were thrown into the ocean, as they believed that by destroying the body, they would prevent the resurrection or return of these powerful figures. fear of rebirth. In many African cultures, including the Congo, there was a belief that the death of an individual was not the end of their influence. If the body remained intact, the spiritual energy of the deceased could return. This is why the colonizers sought to disrupt the spiritual energy by physically destroying the remains of influential leaders. This was seen in many parts of Africa, not just Congo, where the remains of heroes and spiritual leaders were deliberately destroyed or hidden to prevent them from rising again. The Congo people's spiritual resistance. Despite the efforts of the colonizers to destroy the bodies of Congo leaders and the spiritual connection to their ancestors, the Bakongo people continued to resist and survive. Their spiritual resilience and connection to the earth, the ancestors, and the cosmos allowed them to transcend colonial attempts to suppress their identity. The power of the ancestral spirits. The Congo people believed that their ancestors would never truly be gone, even if their remains were destroyed. This spiritual resilience and belief in the eternal power of the ancestors enabled them to keep fighting through prophecy, rituals, and spiritual guidance. Rebirth. Through the people, the spiritual leaders might have died or been destroyed, but their spiritual power lived on through the people. New leaders emerged, inspired by the vision and power of their predecessors. The Bakongo understood that even if their physical bodies were destroyed, their spirit would reincarnate in another form, often through the children or the people they had protected during their reign. Symbolism of the desecration. The colonial destruction of these royal remains can also be seen as an act of cultural erasure. By removing the physical bodies of the Congo leaders and spiritual figures, the Europeans sought to sever the connection to the land, to the ancestors, and to the spiritual power that sustained the Bakongo people. Symbol of dominance. The removal of the royal remains was a symbolic attempt to break the spirits of the Congo people, showing them that their leaders were no longer powerful and that the European way of life had overcome their traditions. The desecration was meant to humiliate and dominate the spirit of the people. Legacy and resurrection. Despite these efforts, the spiritual power of the Bakongo people could not be destroyed. Their connection to the spirit world and their ancestors was far too strong. In fact, many of the spiritual practices and rituals that the Europeans tried to eradicate are now being revived in modern times as part of the cultural renaissance of African traditions and spiritual practices. The history of colonization and the destruction of Congo leaders' remains is a painful but powerful reminder of the resilience of the Bakongo people and their spiritual connection to the ancestors. Their story is one of spiritual warfare, where even in death, their spirits remained unbroken, continuing to guide and protect the people through generations. Their connection to the spirit world, their ability to harness cosmic energy, and their resistance through spiritual practice are evidence of a spiritual legacy that could never be erased. Today, as people reconnect with their spiritual heritage, the Bakongo people continue to inspire movements of cultural and spiritual resurgence, proving that their ancestors' power remains alive. Join the movement. Greetings, family. I am Mikhail Massa, and I invite you to embark on a journey of truth, wisdom, and spiritual awakening. The time has come to restore the forgotten knowledge of the Bakongo people, to uncover the hidden history that colonial forces tried to erase. Together, we will rebuild the kingdom, spread the truth, and empower our people. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Like, comment, and share this video to spread awareness. Join our Telegram group for deeper discussions. Follow us on Telegram. Buy my books, discover ancient wisdom, and empower yourself with knowledge. This is more than content. It's a spiritual revolution. Be part of the movement that will reshape our future. Let's build together. Let's rise together. Subscribe now.